The silent war over digital identity. It's happening without protests, without headlines, without a single shot fired. Every day, pieces of who you are copied, stored, sold, and analyzed by systems you never agreed to trust. And most people don't realize the war has already begun. Today, digital identity sits at the center of power in the modern world. It decides who can access money, who can cross borders, who can speak, and who can be erased with a keystroke. To understand why this matters now, we have to look beyond passwords and profiles and into a deeper shift unfolding beneath everyday technology, because the same systems built to connect us are quietly redefining ownership of the self. For decades, identity lived on paper, locked in physical records and human memory. Then it moved online, fragmented across platforms, databases, and corporations. Each login became a trade. Each verification surrendered a fragment of autonomy. Over time, convenience replaced control, and few questioned the cost. Identity became something we borrowed, not something we owned. The reveal begins with blockchain technology entering the space not as a currency, but as a framework for self-sovereignty. A radical idea emerged. What if identity didn't live on corporate servers or government databases? What if it belonged entirely to the individual, portable, verifiable, and impossible to confiscate without consent? Early experiments appeared quietly. Decentralized identifiers, cryptographic proofs, systems that could confirm truth without exposing personal data. At first, they seemed abstract, even unnecessary. But as data breaches multiplied and surveillance expanded, the value of these ideas became harder to ignore. What looked like a technical upgrade was actually a philosophical challenge. If individuals control their identity, institutions lose leverage. If verification becomes trustless, gatekeepers lose relevance. And if identity becomes programmable, the rules of access, privacy, and power must be rewritten entirely. The silent war isn't about technology alone. It's about who defines you in a digital world, and who profits from that definition. The battle over digital identity deepened as control slipped further from the hands of individuals. Every interaction online demanded proof, yet that proof was rarely owned by the person providing it. Corporations built vast profiles stitched together from browsing habits, financial activity, and behavioral patterns. Governments expanded databases in the name of security and efficiency. Identity became a currency extracted quietly, traded invisibly, and weaponized without warning. This shift created a dangerous imbalance. Those who controlled identity systems gained unprecedented power over access and participation. A single flag could lock someone out of banking. A single algorithmic decision could silence a voice. A single breach could expose millions to fraud and manipulation. The cost of centralized identity wasn't theoretical anymore. It was lived daily by people who had no way to opt out. As awareness grew, so did resistance. Developers and cryptographers began building alternatives that challenged the assumption that identity must be centralized to be trusted. They proposed systems where verification didn't require exposure, where credentials could be proven without being handed over, where privacy and trust could coexist. The technology wasn't flashy. It didn't promise wealth, but it promised something far more fundamental: agency. The conflict intensified when institutions pushed back. Centralized systems argued that decentralization would invite chaos, that without oversight, fraud would explode, that self-sovereign identity was too complex for everyday use. Yet history told a different story. Every major shift in communication and value had faced the same resistance, not because it failed, but because it threatened entrenched control. Meanwhile, real-world pressure mounted. Data breaches became routine. Deepfakes blurred the line between truth and fabrication. Artificial intelligence made impersonation trivial. The question shifted from convenience to survival. How could identity be trusted in a world where reality itself could be forged? Decentralized identity began offering answers, credentials that expired by design, proofs that revealed only what was necessary, systems that worked across borders without permission. Slowly, quietly, a new infrastructure formed beneath the surface of the internet, one that treated identity not as a product, but as a right. But this transformation carried a deeper consequence. If identity could be owned, transferred, and verified without centralized approval, entire power structures would need to adapt. Financial access, political participation, digital citizenship, all depended on identity as control. And that control was being challenged at its core. The war remained silent, but the stakes were becoming impossible to ignore. Because the future of identity would decide not just how we prove who we are, but who gets to decide that at all. As decentralized identity systems matured, the conflict reached a deeper, more unsettling level. It was no longer just about privacy or convenience. It was about power, who held it, who lost it, and who had never been allowed to claim it in the first place. Identity had become the invisible infrastructure behind every modern decision, and changing that infrastructure threatened to reshape society from the ground up. Governments watched cautiously as self-sovereign identity projects gained traction. Some saw opportunity, imagining streamlined services and reduced fraud. Others saw danger, fearing systems they could not fully monitor or control. The idea that a citizen could verify themselves without relying on a state-issued database challenged centuries of administrative authority. For the first time, identity could exist independently of geography. Corporations faced a similar reckoning. Their business models depended on harvesting identity data, logins, preferences, behavioral patterns. Decentralized identity offered a future where platforms no longer owned users, and users no longer paid with their data. This wasn't a technical inconvenience. It was an existential threat to industries built on surveillance and extraction. The tension intensified as real-world trials began. Refugees used decentralized credentials to prove education and work history without documents. Individuals in restrictive regimes accessed financial tools without centralized approval. Professionals verified qualifications instantly without intermediaries. These weren't theoretical use cases. They were proof that identity could function without centralized gatekeepers, and that frightened those who had always been the gatekeepers. At the same time, new risks emerged. What happens when identity is lost, not stolen? What happens when individuals mismanage their own credentials? Responsibility shifted sharply from institutions to people, and not everyone was prepared for that burden. Critics argued that decentralization traded safety nets for freedom, and freedom always carried risk. Inside the community, debates grew intense. Some believed identity systems should include recovery mechanisms tied to trusted parties. Others insisted that any fallback reintroduce central control. The struggle mirrored every decentralization debate before it. Usability versus purity, protection versus autonomy. There were no perfect answers, only trade-offs. As artificial intelligence advanced, the urgency escalated. Deepfake identities flooded the internet. Synthetic humans blurred truth beyond recognition. In that chaos, cryptographic proof emerged as one of the few anchors left, a way to separate authenticity from imitation without exposing the individual behind it. The irony was striking. The more artificial the world became, the more essential decentralized identity grew. The buildup reached a critical point when institutions realized they could not stop the shift, only choose how to engage with it. Identity was no longer just an administrative tool. It was becoming programmable, portable, and personal. And once that door opened, it could never fully close again. The question was no longer whether decentralized identity would exist. It was whether society would be ready for the responsibility that came with owning itself. The turning point arrived when the conversation around identity shifted from resistance to inevitability. Institutions stopped asking how to prevent decentralized identity and started asking how to survive alongside it. The silent war had reached its climax, not with confrontation, but with recognition. The revelation was simple and unsettling. Identity had already escaped centralized control. Data breaches, surveillance fatigue, and digital manipulation had eroded trust beyond repair. People no longer believed that governments or corporations could fully protect who they were online. In that vacuum of trust, self-sovereign identity was an upgrade. It was a necessity. What followed was not collapse, but adaptation. Hybrid systems emerged, blending decentralized credentials with institutional frameworks. Governments explored cryptographic verification without permanent databases. Platforms experimented with login systems that collected nothing at all. The shift wasn't loud. It was structural, and once embedded, it became invisible. The resolution revealed a deeper truth. Identity is not static. It evolves with the tools that define it. For centuries, it belonged to institutions. In the digital age, it was borrowed by platforms. Now, it was returned to individuals, not as a guarantee of freedom, but as an invitation to responsibility. This future demands something uncomfortable. Ownership requires awareness. Autonomy requires discipline. There is no help desk for self-sovereignty, no authority to reverse mistakes without consequence. But there is also no single point of failure, no silent erasure, no invisible hand deciding who belongs. The war over digital identity was never about technology. It was about authorship of the self, and that authorship is quietly shifting back to where it began. So what do you think? Are we ready to own who we are? The